Enlarge the Apple TV 4K and remote. With the Apple TV 4K, Apple is trying to do more than just provide you with a gadget that can stream Netflix or iTunes Store movies in 4K. This device seeks to solve a problem. The digital TV viewing experience is fragmented and bad, especially if you want to use the sorts of TV network apps that gate episodes or live broadcasts behind a cable provider. The Apple TV 4K combines an App Store, single sign-on authentication with cable providers, Siri-driven search, and a centralized TV app to unify your TV viewing experience, whether you're a cord-cutter just looking for an over-the-top addition to your cable subscription. The previous Apple TV had similar goals, but the new model adds a much faster CPU, long overdue 4K and HDR support, and tvOS 11, which is also available on the previous model. tvOS 11 aims to make your life easier with features like AirPods support and home screen sync. And the Apple TV 4K plays games too. Using the Apple TV 4K, I can see and appreciate Apple's vision for a better TV experience. However, the realities of the entertainment business have prevented that vision from being fully realized. The Apple TV 4K might still be a little too far ahead of its time. Attempted renovation of the overall TV browsing and viewing experience aside, this device still aims to be the best, most advanced TV streaming device on the market. Generally, it succeeds, but its high cost and dependency on other Apple services make it fall just shy of an unqualified recommendation. Page 2 to the new Apple TV is identical in many ways to 2015's model, so we'll focus mostly on the differences and the big picture of what it offers to your living room. If you want some more background, be sure to read our prior review of the previous generation Apple TV. The Apple TV 4K and the Apple TV side by side. Can you tell the difference from the bottom? You can see the Apple TV 4K has ventilation, where its predecessor does not. The Apple TV 4K left removes the USB-C port. The Apple TV 4K and the Apple TV with the remotes. On the outside, the Apple TV 4K looks almost identical to its predecessor. It's a small, simple black box. The most notable physical changes are a slightly raised platform that provides ventilation for heat management and the removal of the USB-C port on the back. The port was used for developer access by Macs running Xcode, but this is now possible via Wi-Fi, so the port has been removed. You'll find Ethernet, HDMI, and power cable ports on the back. On the front there's a tiny white blue light that indicates when the device is on. Inside the casing is Apple's A10X Fusion chip, the same one used in the iPad Pro. This chip drives some beautiful games on the iPad Pro, and it has that potential here, too. Then there's the remote. It's essentially the same tiny, touch-sensitive remote that the last Apple TV had. A lot of people hated it. The remote could get lost. It was easy to accidentally press it. And, well, it was different from your standard remote. I used the previous Apple TV a lot, and I did lose my remote in the couch a few times. But the accidental inputs were mostly addressed by a software update. I like using the touch-sensitive surface just like I would a MacBook's touchpad to scroll through pages and pages of apps, TV shows, and movies, or to scrub through a video to find the right scene. I find it to be faster, albeit sometimes less precise than the arrow buttons on a Roku remote. The remote has 5 buttons: the menu button, which usually ends up working like a back button, a play-pause toggle, a Siri button, an up and down volume control, and the TV button. The TV button opens Apple's TV app by default, but that app is not as useful as Apple hoped it would be. More on that shortly. Fortunately, you can easily go into settings and make the TV button take you to the Apple TV's homepage instead if the TV app doesn't end up being central to your needs. The Apple TV 4K remote keeps the same touch-oriented design, with a white border around the menu button to help you stay oriented. The back of the Apple TV 4K remote. The side of the Apple TV 4K remote. The top of the Apple TV 4K remote. The bottom of the Apple TV 4K remote. It charges with an included cable. You can also control the TV with any supported iOS device, which is especially welcome for text. The Apple TV remote's Achilles heel is once again text input. Siri is your best bet without an iOS device, and it works decently. But Siri isn't always going to get it right. Whenever you are carrying your iPhone and a text field comes up, the iPhone will send you a push notification giving you the opportunity to type your query with the iPhone's on-screen keyboard. It's the fastest and easiest way to input text reliably. The Apple TV 4K comes in two SKUs based on storage capacity. The 32GB model is priced at £179, and the 64GB is £199. Most people don't need the 64GB version. I installed every app I could imagine using, including several games, and only made it to 12GB. This device doesn't support downloading of media. All your videos will be streamed. Because of that, you just don't need the space. If more games with lots of high-quality assets hit the platform, that could change in the future for that specific use case. Page 3. The Apple TV 4K finally brings HDR and 4K support to the platform. Since picture quality is the big upgrade here, we'll spend the most time on the 4K HDR image and available content here. Supported standards. In the Ultra HD standard, 4K is a resolution of 3840 by 2160 pixels, or 2160p. That amounts to 4 times as many pixels as the 1080p standard. A sharper image is always nice to see, but most people will experience diminishing returns as the resolution rises. But HDR is a bigger deal. Ars has explained HDR in detail, but the simplified explanation is that HDR increases the number of steps between white and black in an image, both in range and precision. This allows subtler colors and greater, more finely defined contrast between bright and dark parts of the image. The Apple TV 4K supports both popular HDR standards, HDR10 and Dolby Vision, at 4K and up to 60 Hz. Image quality. I was impressed with the image quality of 4K and HDR content on the Apple TV in most cases. In Pacific Rim, the contrast between the neon computer console lights and the dark and rainy nights were just as striking as they would be on an Ultra HD Blu-ray disc. However, die-hard connoisseurs won't be lured away from Ultra HD Blu-ray. To deliver 4K HDR video to your Apple TV, Apple says it uses the relatively new HEVC codec to pack as much visual information as possible into a limited bitrate. For most visuals, it looks great. Unfortunately, it buckles under pressure in others. I watched the final cut of Blade Runner from my iTunes library in 4K and Dolby Vision. It's a movie filled with swirling smoke and flashing lights, exactly the sorts of things that trip up compression algorithms. Artifacts were very noticeable in this film. To be fair, this is to be expected from any streaming device. In most cases, the Apple TV offers 4K and HDR image quality that rivals or beats anything I've seen on other streaming devices. Both Apple's content and Netflix look excellent. 1080p content is not the best I've seen, but it's good enough for the vast majority of viewers. The problem with 1080p is that Apple has chosen to maintain a consistent experience by always outputting everything at 4K and HDR if supported by your TV. I can see why Apple went this way. It means that you never have pauses or flickering when switching between content types, and the menus benefit from the same stuff that the movies do: high resolution, great contrast, and lovely, subtle colors. Unfortunately, it also means that the Apple TV 4K does upscaling from 1080p for you. In some cases, you might prefer your TV's approach to that, especially if you're the type of home theater geek who has carefully crafted an end-to-end system that gives you total control of the picture. You can force the issue by digging into the Apple TV 4K settings app and making the whole thing output at 1080p and then switching back to 4K when you need it, but that's a pain. Like me, you'll probably just leave it on 4K and HDR all the time, but you'll be giving up some control in doing so. Content availability. The Apple TV 4K currently offers 4K HDR movies through the iTunes digital storefront. The selection is not completely comprehensive of all movies that have been released in 4K and HDR to date, but it's a solid start. Unfortunately, number 4K or HDR TV shows are currently available in Apple Store. The only other option you have for viewing 4K HDR content on this device right now is the Netflix app, which performs well. Apple has promised that Amazon Prime is coming to the Apple TV 4K by the end of the year and that it will bring Amazon's 4K HDR original programming. This hasn't happened yet, but it will expand the HDR TV choices when it does. The Apple TV 4 kSecond's home screen in the dark theme. The Movies storefront app now features HDR films. You can browse your library by genre from the Movies and TV storefront apps. Search is a slog with the Apple TV 4K remote. We recommend using your iOS device if you have one. Siri voice input often works better than you'd expect. 2. Hulu doesn't support HDR on any platform, and it only does 4K on the PlayStation 4 Pro and the Xbox One S consoles right now. YouTube has a huge library of 4K videos and a decent selection in HDR, too. Unfortunately, Apple has neglected to support Google's OpenVP9 video codec, so you won't be able to experience them here. That's disappointing. We're not optimistic that it will get resolved immediately, as Apple has not yet announced any plans to support VP9. The Vudu has been offering 4K HDR movies for a while now, and it has some titles in its library that are not available on Apple's own store. Unfortunately, the Vudu Apple TV app still only supported 1080p and SDR when I tested it for this review. With some variation, it's basically the same situation you get when you try to dive into 4K HDR on any platform. The tech is great, but the content library is nascent. We expect a lot of movement in 4K HDR content over the next 2 years, so you're investing in the future here, not so much the present. The picture quality is a big step forward, though, so it's worthwhile if you can afford the hardware. Pricing of the content is also notable. Apple opted to price its 4K and HDR movies at exactly the same prices as its existing HD content. Most services previously offered 4K and HDR films at a premium, but Apple appears to have forced the industry's hand. Both Amazon and Google have lowered their prices since Apple's rollout. In another welcome move, Apple automatically updates users' existing purchases to 4K and HDR if those movies were available in the new formats. As someone who has bought The Fifth Element at least 4 times over the years on VHS, DVD, Blu-ray, and Ultra HD Blu-ray, usually at early adopter premium pricing, I'm very happy to see that in contrast to the status quo. Page 4. Not as much has changed on the audio side of things. It's still good, but there are some formats you might want that aren't supported yet. Apple reports support for the following audio formats: HEAAC V1 AAC up to 320 kilobits per second, protected AAC from iTunes Store, MP3 up to 320 kilobits per second, MP3 VBR, Apple lossless, FLAC, AIFF, and WAV AC3 Dolby Digital 5.1 and EAC3 Dolby Digital Plus 7.1 surround sound. Note that Dolby Digital 5.1 and Dolby Digital Plus 7.1 are covered, but Dolby Atmos is not currently supported. Because the Apple TV 4K is positioned and priced as a top-tier streaming device, it is fair to expect it to support the latest and greatest audio formats, making that list disappointing. Apple has promised Atmos support is coming, but the company hasn't said anything about DTS:X yet. The TV app is the Apple TV's most promising idea, and when the stars align, it's just what we need. The Apple TV's App Store has apps from many of the major TV networks and channels. Some offer the content for free PBS, others require a dedicated subscription HBO Now, and others require authentication with a supported cable provider ESPN. Normally, you'd keep track of which shows are available in which apps, and then you'd navigate to an app you want to check for new episodes. Every app has a different interface, account management system, and tracker of favorite or recently viewed shows. These all vary significantly, not just in user experience but in quality of execution. The Apple TV app puts new and in-progress episodes of shows you watch front and center. Lists of suggestions continue further down in the app. The Apple TV app also lets you browse your purchased movies and TV shows, of course. You can also browse some selections from the store in the app. The idea behind the TV app is that all of those shows would get syndicated in one app, a hub that tracks what you have been watching, what you might want to watch, which shows have new episodes today, and so on. It's a cool idea, and I liked its implementation better than similar ideas from competitors like Rocker's Smart Guide. Apple says that the Apple TV app puts everything you watch in one place, but for many people, it actually won't. Netflix does not work with the TV app, and that's a very notable omission. Whether that's Netflix's fault or Apple's fault is irrelevant, because, either way, the user loses. My cable provider is Hulu's live TV streaming service, and the Hulu Apple TV app lets me watch all my channels live. Several of the individual channel apps also support live TV broadcasts, like Freeform. But unfortunately, these live TV streams don't appear in Apple's TV app. It only shows on-demand episodes from most apps, so you'll have to leave it if you want to watch live in most cases. But then again, a small set of live channels will be available in the TV app later this year. If you've authenticated it with your cable provider, the ESPN app will add live games to your TV homepage. It will even optionally show you the score in the preview. Live news from select networks will also appear in the app, notably CNN and Bloomberg have committed. But today, none of this has been implemented yet. Apple has published a support document noting the apps that are supported by the TV app, and it's an impressive list. Having worked in the industry before, I know the kind of effort it must have taken to wrangle all those networks, and I believe that what Apple is doing to make the TV experience better for users is worthwhile. Only Apple, or a company like it, has the leverage to pull the industry out of the siloed mire in which it has been stuck. But for this vision to be fully realized, it's all or nothing. It's almost all right now, but not quite. Single sign-on, part of Apple's attempt to simplify our streaming, is making logging into all those dozens of apps easier. Normally, you have to enter a password from your cable provider for every one of them. Apple has tried to remedy the situation by allowing you to sign in to your provider once from the Settings app. Then it gives each new app you open access to those credentials, so you don't have to enter them over and over again. I initially tried this with my Hulu account, only to discover that Hulu was not supported. Authenticating all my apps one by one with Hulu was very time-consuming. So to test the single sign-on feature, I started a PlayStation Vue subscription. With that, it worked perfectly. All I had to do was launch an app after installing it and click the app's sign-in button. After 1 to 5 seconds, it authenticated, and I had access to all my content. The only way the implementation would be better would be if you could authorize multiple apps in one click, or if it all just happened automatically with no user input. Enlarge the TV provider menu in the Settings app gives you a list of all network apps that work with your provider for single sign-on. When you browse to TV provider settings, you can see an automatically populated list of apps that your TV provider can authenticate. The list is sorted into apps that are installed and logged in and good to go, apps that are installed but not yet authenticated, and apps that are not yet installed. You can install apps straight from this list, but you have to open them to log them in. This makes things much easier than they used to be, but the stars have to align for it to be the optimal experience. Currently, both the app and the cable provider have to support the feature, and they have to support each other. In some cases, your cable provider might just not offer authentication of digital apps for a certain network, even if that network is in its roster of live channels. Gaming. Games look great on the new Apple TV 4K, though most of the library hasn't been updated to take advantage of the hardware. The controller is basic, but it does have Nintendo Wii-like motion controls. Most games are playable with it, though it's often not as pleasant as the full multi-touch experience you'll get in the same games on iOS. Some games require a traditional gamepad, and there isn't one bundled with the Apple TV 4K. Apple doesn't even make one, instead leaning on other companies to make them. That's too bad, because there's so much potential here. The Apple TV 4K is definitely not an Xbox One X or PlayStation 4 Pro, but the hardware and software available make it feel like it could fill the same sort of casual family console role that the Nintendo Wii did for many years. There are adventure games, spaceflight games, golf games, and yes, it plays Minecraft. There are more good games than you would normally see on a box that's not primarily meant for gaming. It's just too bad that Apple doesn't bundle a controller. There's so much promise for gaming on the Apple TV 4K, but you get the sense Apple isn't giving the potential the full force it deserves. Page 5. In total, 45% of broadband households already own a smart TV, and a similar number have gaming consoles that already have video streaming apps, some of them 4K and HDR. Not everyone needs a new streaming box this year, but the Apple TV offers a much better interface and a wider range of apps than you'll get on the majority of smart TVs or gaming consoles out there. Of course, there are some notable exceptions. TCL's Roku TVs are great, for instance. Attempts to make the odd cable provider authenticated viewing experience easier are admirable, and we want to see them succeed. There's so much that's promising about this device and its approach, but Apple needs to make even more progress with deals in the industry before the Apple TV's full potential comes to fruition. I don't envy the position Apple is in as it tries to negotiate with an industry stuck with competing objectives and few agreed-upon standards, and I'm actually surprised a company known for demanding end-to-end control is even fighting this battle. But I'm glad Apple is using its influence to try to fulfill this vision of what TV could be. If you already lean on Apple for most of your other entertainment needs, the Apple TV 4K is an easy recommendation. You get your existing content in far higher quality with impressive internals that power fun games. If you don't live in that ecosystem, then the current lack of third-party apps that support HDR on this device make it a harder recommendation. A lot of what makes this box great, iPhone control, AirPlay, cross-purchases with the iOS App Store on some games and apps, the iTunes movie library, and so on, has to do with the interplay with other Apple devices. If you don't have other Apple devices, it's mostly just another streaming box, and a pricey one at that. Ultimately, you need to ask yourself how much you believe in the still hypothetical future Apple is trying to create, and how much you want to invest in it. The good, excellent 4K and HDR image quality, including support for the Dolby Vision standard, which some competing devices don't support. Practical, elegant, and intuitive interface, especially if you have an iOS device to augment it. Reasonably priced 4K HDR movies and automatic upgrades in your existing library. Surprisingly strong library of lovely-looking games. The Apple TV is built around the ambitious TV app, but with no Netflix and enormous network app support, the app's functionality remains incomplete. HDR content is currently limited to Netflix and Apple's own store. Critically, YouTube 4K HDR content is not supported. No Dolby Atmos support, yet. The ugly, it's much more expensive than direct competitors. Page 1, 2, 3, 4, 5.